After a lot of struggling and fighting, all of the suspensions. Hey there guys and gals, and welcome back to the D4A channel. Today it's time for episode 4 of the suspension overhaul, and I think there's really no need for an introduction this time around. You know what's going on. We're removing suspension parts like control arms and torque arms and all the other horrible seized rusty junk. The rear has been removed. Now it's time for the front. So let's get to work and remove the front suspension.
So when I first started removing the front suspension, I actually tried to use brains instead of brawn and use my jack to remove the front torque arm bolts. But that did not work because all I did was actually twist up the torque arms and twist up the entire suspension and eventually raise the car. As you can see, the weight of the entire car is not enough to get the bolt removed. So what I had to resort to was removing the front torque arms together with their brackets. So I got my impact wrench and unbolted the bracket bolts, which actually came out pretty easily. Now once that is removed, getting the torque arm out is very easy. There's just the other two bolts that hold it to the control arm. Now I think that while the torque arm is off the car, I will actually have a lot better access to the torque arm bolts, and I'll be able to use my impact wrench properly to get the brackets off the torque arms. Now the torque arms weren't the problem. The problem was this, and that's the control arms, and the control arms in the front caused me the same nightmare that the radius rods did in the rear of the suspension. That's the pins, the metal pins inside the rubber bushings being completely frozen solid to the bolts that hold the control arm to the chassis. Now what I'm doing here is I'm trying my usual strategy, that worked actually on one of the bolts in the rear radius rods, and that is heating up the bolt and then using penetrant foil and then being very stupid, like you see right here, and playing with fire. I actually had to do something to brighten up my mood while fighting these horrible bolts. Please do not do this. This is very stupid and very unsafe, no matter how funny it looks. So after a few cycles of heating up and then using penetrant foil and then using the impact wrench, I realized that I'm not going to torture myself to the extent that I tortured myself in the rear suspension, because despite my strength, the strength of the impact wrench, these situations when the pin is frozen solid to the bolt usually mean that you're going to waste a lot of time and eventually have to resort to cutting the bolt. And that's exactly what I did in this situation. I decided not to waste too much time, so I got my angle grinder and I simply cut off the bolt and removed the front passenger side control arm. Now here you can see the front passenger side control arm with the bolt cut off. Of course, the bolt is still frozen solid to the pin, and no matter how hard you try to hammer it, it will not come out. I even used a sledgehammer after this and hit it very hard, but that bolt is frozen solid. Now the nightmare that was caused by the passenger side control arm honestly was nothing compared to the nightmare that was caused by the driver's side control arm, which was horribly frozen solid, and even removing it from the chassis was another pain. And honestly, I had to resort to actual carnage and hacking the whole thing up to get it off the car. And that's something I'm gonna tell you about right now in the rest of the video.
Whew. So after a lot of struggling and fighting, all of the suspension components are finally off the car. The last thing that was putting up a fight was the front driver's side control arm bolt, and here's the carnage I had to do to get this thing off the car. Of course, the bolt that holds it to the chassis had to be cut off. And what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to separate the pin from the bolt, and this is what I've been talking about throughout my suspension overhaul. This is the thing that makes the problem. it's the pin that's inside the rubber bushing that gets frozen to the bolt, and separating them is impossible. What I have been doing right now is I took a hammer and I've been hitting this thing with a hammer really hard, and I managed to deform it a bit. I don't know if you'll be able to see that. So, as you can see, I've managed to deform it, and it looks like the pin and the bolt are about to separate, but that is not the case at all. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this thing and I'm going to cut it lengthwise just to see if that's going to be enough to separate this pin and this bolt. Now, just to be clear, these things are never meant to be fused together. The bolt is meant to come out of the pin very easily, just, you know, you should be able to pull it out with your hand. Also, as you can see, the garage is a horrible, disgusting mess from all this job. And here is all of the penetrating lubricants I spent during the suspension removal. I actually threw a couple of more of them out already, so I think it was a total about 8 or 9. Here's the horror on this side of the car as I was working. So look at that, so messy and disgusting, all the tools. I am not a neat person. So as I said, I'm gonna take this thing now and cut it lengthwise with my angle grinder and see if that was, you know, that will be enough to separate this monster of a rusted pin and bolt and whatever. Here we have the pin and the bolt finally separated. Cutting them lengthwise like this was the only way to get them apart, and even after I got them apart, a good whack with a hammer was necessary to get the pin to finally release the bolt. As you can see, the rust is very substantial, and I think separating these two things while they are still on the car is truly a mission impossible. But I think that all of this suffering has definitely led to a very important scientific breakthrough, and that is that rust is the next space age material. Because if it's this strong, I think that the spaceships that will colonize outer space should be made from rust. Because, you know, obviously carbon fiber is a sham, and so is titanium, and so is everything else. Because if rust can take this kind of abuse, it will definitely be good enough to take all the lasers of the, you know, alien species that we are going to meet in outer space. Yeah. Okay, I have obviously started rambling, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tidy up the garage, and I'm going to lay down all of the suspension from the MR2 so we have a nice little educational overview. So here we have pretty much the entire MR2 suspension laid out. Now the MR2 suspension is a McPherson strut in both the front and in the rear. The McPherson strut is an independent type of suspension, and that's always good for performance, for handling, for comfort. I have also removed here a shock and a wheel hub just to show you how the suspension connects to these two things. I didn't show you how to remove these because it's super simple. There's just 4 bolts holding this thing to the chassis, and you can access these when you remove the front lid of the front trunk. Some people call it the frunk, or when you remove the engine lid in the back. You remove those 4 bolts, and then there's just 2 bolts, this one and that one, connecting here to the wheel hub. So once you remove those bolts, the shock comes out really easily. Same goes for the wheel hub. Once you remove the connection to the steering rack, that's the connection with this, with the tie rod, with the outer tie rod of the steering rack. It too will be removed very easily. So let's take just another thing to mention, a very useful tip. This was easily removed because I had an impact wrench. If you do not have an impact wrench, do not even dream about trying to remove suspension components from an older car unless that older car has been held in a museum or a vacuum or some other sort of controlled climate, because you'll experience the nightmare of a lifetime. without a good impact wrench and a decent compressor like this 100 liter 3 horsepower thing I have, this job is impossible. Even with these things, it's still a nightmare, but without them, it's impossible. So let's take a look at the suspension. Now, as I said, McPherson strut, and how that works. Well, here you have your control arm. The control arm is bolted to the chassis here in a position pretty much like this. Then you have these two bolt holes. They connect to the radius rod or the torque arm. Here you have the torque arm. It's connected to this bracket. This bracket is then connected to the chassis. Here you have the rubber bushings, just like on all the other suspension components. They absorb the vibrations and other nasty, uncomfortable stuff. Now, the control arm is then connected to the ball joint. Here you have the ball joint, goes in there like so, and then the ball joint is connected to the wheel hub right there. You can see the two bolt holes for the ball joint. The ball joint, of course, moves, and then the connection is made to the shock and the wheel hub, as I already explained. Here we have the front sway bar. Now the MR2 also has a rear sway bar, but it works the same way as the front, so I didn't remove it. The front sway bar connects to the chassis here, and then it connects via this link to the shock right here. So that's the front. Here we have the rear, and it works pretty much the same way as the front. Here we have the two brackets that connect to the chassis, and then there's spaces in the brackets where you have the rear control arm and the rear tie rod. And then again you have, oops, sorry, dropped my light there. And then you have the rear radius rod. It's right there. It connects to the rear control arm right here. The connection, as you can see, is slightly different. And then we have the same system with the ball joint. Ball joint goes here, and then two bolts to the wheel hub, and then again the same connection with the shock. The MR2 has also rear tie rods. These are used to adjust your camber. Now, as I already said, I will be throwing these things in the dumpster because these cannot be repaired at all. These are usually so seized that they are completely useless. So what I will be doing probably is getting a set of brand new rear tie rods from Techno Toy Tuning that look super pretty and are super beefy to solve this problem. Now, rear tie rods do not exist anymore for the MR2. You cannot buy them new from a Toyota dealership. You cannot buy them from, any OEM style aftermarket brands. You cannot get ones like this. And we have to be thankful to companies like Techno Toy Tuning and some other guys out there that are actually still making parts like this for the MR2 and for some other, old cool cars that, the general public may have forgotten slightly. So here we have the suspension. It's finally out. I'm super happy about this. And now the next steps, as I have already told you probably many times, is we're going to remove all the old rubber bushings, and we are going to get all of this stuff sandblasted and then powder coated so it all looks super pretty. The ball joints will of course be replaced, and we are putting in brand new Prothane polyurethane suspension bushings. So I guess that's it when it comes to this episode of the suspension overhaul. I have to say I'm very tired, but I have finally won this very grueling war of removing suspension components from my MR2. So thanks a lot for watching today. Don't forget to stay tuned for upcoming videos, both on the suspension and on my bike carb conversion and on some other interesting stuff to come. Thanks a lot for all of your support so far. It means a lot, it helps me keep this little channel going. Also, don't forget to share, like, comment and subscribe as always. And of course, see you soon on the D4A channel.